Welcome to the ADA Self-Evaluations and Transition Plans for Public Rights-of-Way. This seminar will provide the minimum federal requirements for local public agencies that are creating their Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, self-evaluation and their ADA transition plans. The topics we will cover in this presentation are the basic Americans with Disabilities Act requirements for local governments and their entities, the ADA self-evaluation, the ADA transition plan. Included will be the citations to the corresponding federal laws, known as USCs, and Code of Federal Regulations, or CFRs. The overall law that we're looking at is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, as well as the ADA Amendments Act of 2008. Now, the Americans with Disabilities Act is a broad civil rights statute that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life. For public roadways, we will focus on Title II of the ADA. Title II of the ADA prohibits disability discrimination by state and local government entities. In particular, Subpart A of Title II covers public rights-of-way. So what is a public entity anyway? Well, it is by definition any state or local government and any department, agency, special purpose district, or other instrumentality of a state or states or local government. Who enforces the ADA? The United States Department of Justice has overall rulemaking authority and enforcement responsibility for the ADA, while the United States Department of Transportation is charged with ensuring accessibility compliance relating to transportation. The Federal Highway Administration Office of Civil Rights oversees compliance with DOT requirements for highways, streets, and traffic management. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 has additional requirements that apply to public entities receiving federal funding from the United States Department of Transportation, either directly or indirectly. What are the minimum requirements for a Title II entity to comply with the ADA? But first, a note about minimums. What I'm talking about are the base federal minimums that all Title II entities must do. But you're always strongly encouraged to do better to make sure that all of your facilities are accessible to a person with disabilities. I'll separate out this presentation into two separate categories. One are, what are the requirements for all Title II entities? And two, what are the requirements for Title II entities that have 50 or more employees and or Title II entities that are direct or indirect recipients of federal funds from the United States Department of Transportation. All Title II entities must provide notice and perform a self-evaluation. Providing notice is their ADA policy statement that they as a government do not discriminate against an individual because they have a disability. This is a document that must be adopted and distributed. So what information shall be included in this document? The notice is required to include relevant information regarding Title II of the ADA and how it applies to programs, services, and activities of the public entity. The notice should not be overwhelming. An effective notice states the basic of what the ADA requires of the local government without being too lengthy, legalistic, or complicated. Many use the United States Department of Justice notice under the Americans with Disabilities Act as the baseline of their notice. It is a one-page document in the standard font and includes a brief statement about employment, effective communication, making reasonable modification to policies and programs, not placing surcharges on modifications or auxiliary aids and services, and how to file a complaint. This is the Justice Department's sample notice. You can pause the video at this time to take a closer look. As you can see, it is short, to the point, and importantly, understandable to the general public and the government's personnel. The next item that all Title II entities must do is conduct a self-evaluation. A public entity shall evaluate its current services, policies, and practices. Self-evaluations first became a requirement in Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. It was additionally reaffirmed in 1990 with the Americans with Disabilities Act. A public entity shall evaluate its current services, policies, and practices, and the effect thereof that do not or may not meet the requirements, and to the extent modifications of any such services, policies, and practices is required, the public entity shall proceed to make the necessary modifications. A public entity shall provide an opportunity to interested persons, including individuals with disabilities or organizations representing individuals with disabilities, to participate in the self-evaluation process. What to include in your self-evaluation? Here are just a few of the items you might want to consider. Sidewalks. Do you have adequate width? Do you have an obstruction blocking the way? Do you have a good cross slope, running slope, and vertical discontinuity, which can be a tripping hazard to others? Crosswalks. Do you have appropriate width, if marked? Do you have a good cross slope? A lot of variations on this depending on what standard or guidance you're using. Running slope, as well as the surface condition as well. One of the biggest places people look are curb ramps. Do you have missing curb ramps? Are they required to be at those spots? Do you have appropriate width, cross slope, running slope? Do you have a turning space or landing on them? Do you have the appropriate bottom clear space fully within the crosswalks it serves and outside of the parallel travelway? Do you have detectable warning surfaces for the people that are blind or low vision? Do you have appropriate flares? As well as, do you have proper alignment between your curb ramp and your crosswalks? Also look at your street furniture. Do you have any obstacles blocking the way? It could even have a tripping hazard for all other pedestrians as well. Do you have visual pedestrian signal heads? You need the audible and vibratory push buttons for the blind and low vision pedestrians when you have those visual indications for other pedestrians. Are your accessible pedestrian push buttons placed in accordance to the manual and uniform traffic control device? And also look at on-street parking, as well as other components in the public rights-of-way, such as bus shelters. You must review everything: buildings, parking lots, pedestrian environments, for which you are responsible for. A question that comes up often is the maintenance of accessible features. A public entity shall maintain in operable working condition those features of facilities and equipment that are required to be readily accessible to and usable by persons with disabilities. Can a public agency make private individuals or businesses responsible for ADA and Section 504 mandated pedestrian access? According to the Federal Highway Administration, the answer is no. The public agency is responsible for providing access for persons with disabilities. Now that you know what must be included in your self-evaluation, how do you actually conduct your ADA self-evaluation? Start by creating an initial inventory of your facilities. You may already have this information from your asset management program, so don't duplicate efforts if you already have to. Conduct an actual field survey and visit each of the sites and locations to determine the level of accessibility. Do not rely on online resources. Though they can be a useful tool to help create your inventory, they will not provide you with the needed measurements. You will need to take physical measurements of your various components. The inventory should note who is responsible for the facility compliance, such as the state, county, or town. Sidewalks along state roads are often problematic in this area. Is the state responsible for the sidewalk? Is it the county or town? Coordination of the Title II entities responsible for the civil rights accessibility requirements is critical. Similarly, transit facilities owned by roadway agencies but operated by others can also be problematic. As before, communications is critical. Here are a few keys to success for your self-evaluation. Ideally, you have a budget and a staff identified through your entire transition plan phase. Because of the cost that may be involved with creating this self-evaluation, people have to look at other alternatives. Some have used properly trained and supervised interns. There are newer technologies such as LiDAR survey that may be available and appropriate if you're a larger agency. Prioritize high pedestrian areas first, thus being able to make impacts prior to completing the full inventory. Prioritize using a scale 1 to 5 or colors such as red, yellow, green, but do not duplicate your work. Performing an ADA self-evaluation may seem like a big task. For municipalities with a lot of pedestrian facilities in the public rights-of-way, this is true. But for many small communities with very few facilities, it can be reasonably quick to perform your ADA self-evaluation. As a reminder, the ADA self-evaluation by Title II entities is one of the fundamental ADA requirements and was required to be performed decades ago. Not having one or deciding not to perform one is not acceptable. In summary, the basic ADA requirements for all Title II entities are 1. Provide notice of your ADA policy, and 2. Perform a self-evaluation of your services, policies, and practices. Title II entities with 50 or more employees or are subject to Section 504, since they are direct or indirect recipients of federal funds, have additional minimum requirements. For brevity purposes, I'll refer to this as 50+/504. But first, how do you count to 50? It's the total number of employees of an overall government, including all departments and all instrumentalities, including schools, police, fire, public works, administrators, and so forth. Here are the requirements for the 50+/504s. As before, they must 1. Provide notice, 2. Provide a self-evaluation, but with additional items. Additionally, they must designate an ADA coordinator and establish and publish a grievance procedure and develop a transition plan. What are the additional items they must include when they perform this self-evaluation? They must keep it on file and make it available for public inspections. This includes a list of interested persons consulted, a description of the areas examined and any problems they identified, and a description of any modifications they have done. A next item a Title II entity with 50 or more employees or subject to Section 504 must do is designate at least one responsible employee to coordinate all ADA compliances. A government entity may elect to have more than one ADA coordinator. The ADA coordinator is responsible for coordinating the efforts of the government entity to comply with Title II and investigating any complaints that the entity has violated. The name, office address, and telephone number of the ADA coordinator must be provided to interested persons. ADA coordinators should have familiarity with your state or your local government structure, activities, and its employees. They need to have knowledge of the ADA, as well as other laws addressing the rights of people with disabilities, such as Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And they should have experience with people with a broad range of disabilities. Knowledge of various alternative formats and alternative technologies that enable people with disabilities to communicate, participate, and perform tasks. The ability to work cooperatively with local governments and the people with disabilities, and familiarity with local disability advocacy groups or other disability groups. They should also have skills and training in negotiation and mediation, as well as organizational and analytical skills. Even if you have less than 50 employees, you can still benefit from having an ADA coordinator. The next requirement of a Title II entity with 50 or more employees or those subject to Section 504 is to have a complaint procedure. These Title II entities must adopt and publish a grievance procedure and provide prompt and equitable resolution of the complaint alleging any actions that would have been prohibited by the ADA. Your complaint procedure should specify who may file a complaint, time of filing, where to file, that you will acknowledge receipt or acceptance of the complaint, that you will perform an investigation and compliance review, voluntary compliance agreements, and what are the referral options for that person filing the complaint if you're unable to reach a satisfactory resolution to the complaint. Now that it's time to establish your grievance procedure, where do you start? Many Title II entities have used the Justice Department's sample grievance procedure and made the necessary edits. You may pause the video at this time to take a closer look. As with the ADA notice, it is short, to the point, and understandable. The next item, a Title II entity with 50 or more employees or subject to Section 504, must perform is the creation of an ADA transition plan. When structural modifications are required to achieve program accessibility, such as required curb ramps, a transition plan must be created that provides for the removal of these barriers. ADA transition plans shall have the following elements. Identify, list the physical obstacles and their locations. This is information that you will get from creating your ADA self-evaluation. Describe in detail and the methods that you will use to make the modifications to make your facilities accessible. Provide a schedule for making the access modifications. Provide a yearly schedule if the transition plan is more than 1 year in timing. And provide the name and position of the official who's responsible for implementing the ADA transition plan. In addition, public entities shall provide an opportunity to interested persons, including individuals with disabilities or organizations representing those individuals, to participate in the development of your transition plan. A copy of the transition plan shall be made available for public inspection. When must a transition plan be completed? According to the Federal Highway Administration, under Section 504, self-evaluations and transition plans should have been completed by December 29, 1979. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, transition plans should have been completed by July 26, 1992, and corrective measures should have been completed by January 26, 1995. While these dates have long passed, entities that did not develop a transition plan prior to these dates should begin immediately to complete their self-evaluation and develop a comprehensive transition plan. So let's expand on the transition plan elements. The information you collected as part of your ADA self-evaluation for your pedestrians' facilities in your roads right-of-way is the information you will use for this part. There are many elements in the rights-of-way you may have to look at. Do you have the required curb ramps, and if yes, were they properly designed and constructed? Are you missing any of the elements on your curb ramps? Sidewalks are often forgotten about, but cross slopes, pathway width, and vertical discontinuities from poor maintenance make many prepared pedestrian surfaces impassable to people with limited mobility. Don't forget your parking lots and your on-street parking. Pedestrian signals need corresponding audible and vibratory indication. Bus stops, shared use trails, your parks and recreational facilities. The list varies from town to town. Now that you know what and where your physical obstacles are, you will need to describe in detail how you will make them accessible. A curb ramp could be installed or reconstructed to the current standards during a roadway resurfacing project. Sidewalk slabs have many methods besides replacement to make them accessible. If you have visual pedestrian signals, can you install accessible pedestrian signals for the blind and low vision pedestrian so they can receive the information when the walk signal is on? The next transition elements are to provide a schedule for making your access modification, and if it takes more than 1 year to complete the modifications, then you will need to prepare a multi-year schedule for the modification. Your transition plan must include a schedule for providing access features, including curb ramps for walkways. This schedule should first provide pedestrian access upgrades to state and local government offices and facilities, transportation, places of public accommodation, and employers, followed by walkways serving other areas. With all the potential items to include in your schedule of modifications, you will need to further prioritize your work. The ADA Best Practice Toolkit for state and local governments provides suggestions for your priority list. Generally, curb ramps are first priority. Even with curb ramps, there is a priority order as well. Curb ramps and other pedestrian access routes, including sidewalks and crosswalks that were constructed or altered after the ADA took effect and are not compliant with the ADA, are the highest priority. These are pedestrian facilities that should have been designed and constructed in accordance with the ADA curb ramp and pathway standards and are supposed to be compliant. The remainder of this list is similar to the overall schedule we saw before. Moving down the priority list are parking lots, pedestrian signals, bus stops, shared use trails, and park and recreational facilities. If you know you have areas with people with disabilities that need access improvements, you can move these items up on your priorities schedule. Provide the name and the position of the official who is responsible for implementing the transition plan. This may not be the ADA coordinator, as it should be the person that has control over the work that needs to be performed in this schedule. monitor the work you do and take credit for the work you are doing to make accessibility improvements. The transition plan is a living document that needs regular updates as you complete modifications or as other changes happen along your public streets that will be added to your list of modifications, such as added street furniture or damage to path of travel from storms. Earlier in this presentation, we saw this list of items for Title II entities with 50 or more employees or those who must follow Section 504. It is common practice to include them all as part of your ADA transition plan as they fulfill the elements needed for the transition plan. You may include the name of your ADA coordinator, but it's required that you have the name of the person that is responsible for implementing your ADA transition plan. Here's an example of one small town's table of contents for their ADA transition plan. The introduction explains the purpose of the transition plan and includes their policy statement. The legal requirements go into legal authority for the creation of the transition plan. The obstacles are items that are identified in their self-evaluation. This is followed by the schedule, the person responsible for implementing a transition plan, how the public can provide input, which includes the ADA complaint procedure, and finally, attachments. For larger transition plans, the self-evaluation information and schedule for modifications are included with the attachments due to their size. To help local roadway agencies working on their transition plans, the Federal Highway Administration has available online the State Transition Plan Attributes Review Guide. This is a document the FHWA uses when they review state transportation agencies' transition plans to determine if they have included the minimum attributes for the ADA transition plan. Even though the document was created for review of state transition plans, county and municipal roadway agencies can benefit by using it as a reference to determine if they are meeting the minimum attributes for their transition plans. In summary, your transition plans will have the following elements: identify and list the physical obstacles and their locations, describe in detail how you will make these facilities accessible, provide a schedule for making the accessible modifications, provide a yearly schedule if your transition plan will take more than 1 year to complete, and provide the name and position of the official who is responsible for implementing the ADA transition plan. And in summary, for Title II entities with 50 or more employees or are subject to Section 504, they must provide notice, perform a self-evaluation, designate an ADA coordinator, establish and publish a grievance procedure, and develop a transition plan. I hope you found the information on the basic requirements for the ADA self-evaluation and transition plans for the public rights-of-way to be useful. If you have not performed either your ADA self-evaluation or your transition plans, please do start as soon as possible. We all have the responsibility to ensure our government programs and facilities are accessible to all individuals, and your efforts with the improvements outlined in your transition plans will make this possible. Good luck with your ADA self-evaluation and transition plans.